Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our program where we unravel the tangled web of finance and politics. And there's plenty to discuss as the U.S. presidential election approaches. Today, we're tackling a hot topic that is silently wreaking havoc on millions of Americans' wallets. The death of the middle-class American dream as we knew it, and how, despite the platitudes from politicians, we seem to keep falling further behind. Oh yes, inflation is down and wages are up. But don't let the fancy numbers fool you. The fundamental pillars of the middle-class lifestyle, like homeownership, education, and mobility, are rapidly slipping out of reach for far too many. Higher paychecks be damned. What use are they when the cost of living is skyrocketing faster than a hot air balloon at full throttle? According to recent data, affording a home with a simple 20% down payment now costs 83% of a median family's annual income. You heard that right. That's up from 65% back in 2016, folks. In the few short years since last election season, just owning a house, the cornerstone of American prosperity, has become a laughable dream unless you're already sitting on mounds of cash. Oh, and let's not even start on car ownership. The simple, quintessential American ideal of owning a new car takes 2 more weeks of work than it did just 8 years ago. So, what are you working for? The joyride you'll never have? What about childcare and education? These were supposed to be investments in the next generation, a stepping stone to upward mobility. But now, they're black holes sucking up what little financial stability remains in the middle-class household. Childcare now eats up more than a third of family income, and if you're looking at sending your child to a private college, better take a seat. You'll need 3/4 of your yearly income just to cover the tuition. Welcome to America's new normal, where raising a family appears more like a bankrupting hobby than a fulfilling life goal. Do you remember back in 2021 when wages were finally going up? It felt like a glimmer of hope. But don't be fooled. Wages went up, yes, but cost of living went up even faster. For those lucky enough to already own a home, skyrocketing home values might have felt like a wealth-building event. But for the rest of us, it might as well be a prison sentence, locking future generations out of the housing market altogether. Economists like Stuart Paul over at Bloomberg break the issue down further. The cost of down payments has become a choking bottleneck, where high prices, not just high interest rates, make home buying conditions feel insurmountable. These massive down payment requirements are why, despite inflation cooling and wages rising, over 60% of Americans report that their financial well-being is in shambles. And it's not just housing. Do you remember a time when buying a car didn't involve filling out more paperwork than buying a house? Car prices have soared to the point where you're forking out around $1,000 a month just to own that shiny new vehicle of yours. A 30% jump since before the pandemic. How are families faring? Well, they aren't faring. They're simply hanging on by a thread. The average age of cars on the road now is 14 years. So much for the freedom of mobility. So there it is, folks, summarizing life in 2024. You've got more money in your paycheck, but everything you need to actually live a middle-class life has skyrocketed beyond reach. Your home, your car, your kids' schooling, and even child care seem calculated to bankrupt you. If not immediately, then eventually. Let's dive deep into the most emotional and essential dimension of this crisis. Housing. If you're like Air Force veteran Jerry Sink, trying to buy a house in California now requires skills that even Jedi training wouldn't prepare you for. Despite a VA loan, ostensibly one of the most generous mortgage options available to our veterans, he still finds it impossible to afford a simple home in today's market. How did it come to this, you ask? Well, we've got a market failure nearly a decade in the making, where demand far outstrips supply. To be exact, we've seen one of the biggest housing price booms in history. Prices aren't just unreasonably high because of interest rates, though those aren't helping either. The most significant pressure is that we haven't been building enough homes for over 10 years. So while the Federal Reserve may soon get inflation under control and bring down rates, it won't matter much if you have no affordable homes to buy. It's obvious, folks, the system isn't broken by accident. The wealthiest have benefited from rising home prices, which have now doubled their wealth, while the average American family has gotten increasingly locked out of this form of asset building. It's a cruel irony, isn't it? The very American dream that made the middle class great is now a pipe dream unless you're lucky enough to inherit property. But don't get too comfortable thinking this problem is only about housing. Cars, those hulking symbols of American freedom, are also becoming less attainable. AAA tells us that the average cost of car ownership is about $1,000 per month now, up from $774 before the pandemic, thanks to spiraling loan payments and climbing insurance premiums. Let's not forget maintenance and fuel, which are hardly pocket change anymore. So if you're making a median income in the US and buying a new car feels impossible, that's not in your head. It's very real. The question that we're left scratching our heads with is why? Why is every pillar of American life steadily being priced into oblivion for the middle class? We were told that education would be the great equalizer. But today, college costs are nothing short of terrifying. Oh sure, private colleges are taking up 75% of household income and public in-state universities aren't much better at a third of your yearly paycheck. But for what? To sit atop a mountain of more debt. And don't get us started on the $1.6 trillion in student loans currently crushing over 40 million Americans. Eric Huber, living in Wisconsin, is sitting on $80,000 in student loans for a degree he isn't sure will pay off. Wage stagnation, mounting debt, and education that's too expensive to justify. The middle class is drowning slowly but surely. Can the children go to school? Sure, if you don't plan on saving for retirement, your own medical emergencies, or their future. What should be the foundation to a prosperous life is now an anchor weighing down today's families. And it's not just tuition. It's all the other costs families need to cover, like textbooks, meals, and incidentals that turn the higher education dream into a looming financial nightmare. What's worse? College used to guarantee you'd land in the middle class. Nowadays, students graduate questioning whether they'll even break even. With the debt they're already accumulating, they're looking at decades-long struggles to pay loans off, often leaving them wondering if they'll ever be able to buy a home or car, or even support a family. The point of going to college was to avoid being poor, not insure it. But why stop at student loans? Let's not forget about credit card debt sitting at a record $1.14 trillion. Millions of families have turned to swiping plastic in a desperate attempt to offset the spiraling costs of groceries, rent, car payments, and medical bills. Do we hear a slight echo of the 2008 financial crisis? Oh yes, but this time it's even more insidious because wages aren't quite keeping pace, pushing otherwise stable middle-class families closer and closer to the edge. As we gear up for the election, both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are eager to pander to middle-class economic anxiety. But the truth is, neither party has offered a convincingly cohesive plan to fix the systemic problems plaguing housing affordability, education, or skyrocketing debt. Harris wants to focus on first-time homebuyer aid, while Trump's selling the good old days when taxes were lower and tariffs were plenty. But can either actually deliver on bringing homeownership and affordability back to reality? Let's be frank. Neither option is a silver bullet that will save us from financial oblivion. The complexity of today's problems is rooted in long-term structural failure, a broken labor market, insufficient social safety nets, ballooning costs for society's most essential goods, and policies that prop up wealth inequality rather than dismantle it. Both candidates are playing to our nostalgia, whether it's Trump with his fantasy of lower taxes and fewer immigrants, or Harris with her promises of a $25,000 homebuyer grant. But how many times have we been fed such sugar-coated promises before, only to watch real solutions melt away as soon as the polls close? So what's the takeaway from all this, you ask? The American dream isn't dead, but boy, is it on life support. And unless we, as a society, confront the systemic issues plaguing the middle class with recalibrated economic policies and real accountability, this dream might very well become a relic of the past, told in nostalgic terms by older generations. First and foremost, it's important to recognize that housing can't be fixed with band-aid solutions like temporary rate cuts or modest first-time homebuyer assistance programs. We need policymakers to stop hiding behind short-term fixes and acknowledge the root of the housing crisis, a chronic shortage of affordable homes. The last decade has seen local governments consistently fail to build new housing at a pace commensurate with demand. Whether driven by restrictive zoning laws, a lack of investment in suburban infrastructure, or environmental restrictions, the fact remains. The country needs millions of new homes, and these homes need to be accessible to middle and working-class families. Are Harris's proposals to construct 3 million more homes during her first term enough? Well, it's a good start on paper, but the reality of turning that into actual affordable homes quickly faces obstacles, like zoning laws that can take years to reform and a construction industry still reeling from labor shortages and expensive material costs. Will those down payment assistance programs make a dent? Perhaps, but as long as homes are being built at a snail's pace, these solutions, although a step in the right direction, fall short of addressing the elephant in the room: supply-side constraints. Meanwhile, Trump's solution, deporting millions of undocumented immigrants in hopes of reducing housing demand, is not only inhumane but unlikely to have any meaningful impact on affordability. With the wealthiest still scooping up property, often as investment assets, housing dynamics are driven far more by speculative forces than demographic trends. So, where does that leave the rest of us? In an endless game of wait and see, hoping housing prices might miraculously drop, or that a downturn crashes the market. Not a great foundation for economic security, is it? Let's turn for a moment to two of the most financially exhausting elements that keep middle-class families constantly on edge: healthcare costs and childcare. Remember, these aren't luxury expenses. This isn't purchasing the latest iPhone or a fancy vacation. These are daily and monthly necessities that tangle American families in an endless web of financial distress. When childcare costs repeatedly consume a third or more of a family's after-tax income, it positions many families in a no-win scenario. Parents like Efren Mene, who struggle to juggle child care costs while maintaining jobs, are forced to make impossible trade-offs. If wages don't match the rising expense of child care, how can families hope to invest in their children's future and support themselves? Programs like Biden's proposed expanded child tax credit offered a brief lifeline during the pandemic, providing instant relief and pushing millions just above the poverty line. But much like everything else these days, it was short-lived, and now millions of families are contending with the full burden once more. And healthcare? Don't get me started. In a country that prides itself on individual opportunity and freedom, one medical emergency can slice through years of savings faster than a hot knife through butter. The U.S. healthcare system is one of the most expensive in the world, and for many middle-class families, healthcare costs are an unpredictable and massive economic threat. Medical expenses can swamp a family's financial ship long before they even see the bill. Insurance deductibles, premiums, co-pays, out-of-network charges, prescription medication costs. The list is endless. While Trump promises lower tax rates and reduced regulation, none of his plans so far have tackled the ballooning healthcare costs that sap away disposable income. Harris's talk of expanded public healthcare options and prescription drug price reform sound good, but we've yet to see any real traction in the legislative war zone where lobbyists hold more sway than public sentiment. This is the practical reality. People can't save, can't buy homes, and can't afford college when every minor illness or child care expense turns into another mountain of debt. How are we supposed to achieve the American dream when the basic building blocks of a secure life are dismantling underneath us, brick by brick? Now, about education. Remember when going to college was seen as the golden ticket to the middle class? Today, higher education feels more like a gamble. You gather up all your savings, maybe take out a few loans, and you send yourself or your child off to university with the hope that a decent-paying job will help you pay it all back someday. Except that job may no longer exist by the time graduation rolls around, or if it does, it certainly doesn't pay enough to cover both living expenses and student debt repayments. With tuition costs at many private colleges escalating well beyond six figures, college-bound students now start their adult lives in a financial hole that can take decades to climb out of. Yes, many families depend on scholarships, grants, or any other assistance they can get, but the reality remains. Millions of Americans continue to borrow, to a combined total of a staggering $1.6 trillion in student loan debt. Yet, policymakers seem to dither on solutions. Harris trots out ideas like tuition-free community college, but even well-intentioned initiatives like these fall short in addressing the fact that student loans saddle new generations with lifelong burdens that act like economic quicksand. And let's be clear, the college system wasn't always designed to break the bank. For many of today's older voters, attending a four-year public university in the United States meant relatively modest tuition compared to today's astronomical demands. The average American family now faces a college system that threatens to financially cripple their future, rendering education not as a bridge to opportunity, but a path that leads nowhere. Now imagine dealing with all of the above and then adding a cherry on top in the form of unbridled credit card debt. Today, American households hold a record of $17.8 trillion in total debt, with a whopping $1.14 trillion of that on credit cards. With wages barely keeping up with inflation, Middle-class families have increasingly turned to high-interest debt to stay afloat. Credit cards have become lifelines for necessities like food, gas, and increasingly expensive utilities. But these lifelines come with some of the highest interest rates attached. How do American families dig themselves out from under this mountain of financial obligations? Spoiler alert, many won't. And unless we address the predatory nature of these financial instruments and put teeth behind reforms, it might not be long before we revisit some of the darkest economic periods in modern history. The Federal Reserve may have focused on fighting inflation, but at what cost? Pinching consumer access to affordable credit on the one hand and ratcheting up interest rates on the other just adds salt to the wound. The aftermath is obvious. Economic activity slows, wages stagnate, and debt continues swelling until it bursts. Now, what about our political leaders? They throw around earnest slogans, promising to fix the deeply entrenched problems. Kamala Harris's take is to tackle middle-class struggles with an opportunity economy. Whether that's through affordable childcare or down payment assistance for first-time homebuyers, she's placing her bets on policies meant to ease internal market pressures. But let's face it, most of these solutions are backloaded. Housing assistance and community college programs won't fix people's immediate stresses around groceries, gas, or healthcare costs. They might provide a helping hand in the coming years, but for those struggling right now, these promises feel like too little, too late. Then there's Donald Trump, who's riding high on pre-pandemic nostalgia. He promises tariffs to bring back manufacturing jobs, lowers taxes, and, who could forget, the wall to stop immigrants, hoping to shrink housing demand by reducing the population. But even if Trump's previous economic policies gave the market a sugar rush, the fundamental brutal economic forces that have powered housing shortages, skyrocketing tuition, and wage stagnation won't be fixed by nostalgic indulgence. And given the immense deficit and national debt left behind from his administration, combined with the impacts of the global pandemic, pretending we can tax cut our way out seems delusional at best. So what now? How does the middle class get back on its feet? A few structural changes could carve out a pathway forward if our political leaders stop playing to short-term votes and actually tackle the long-term systemic injustice Americans are facing. 1. Address the supply side of housing. Real zoning reform and ample federal investment in affordable housing construction need to happen on a national scale. And no, this isn't about building luxury high-rises. We mean entry-level homes for working-class families. 2. Healthcare reform. We need to do more than expand coverage, and we must challenge the insurance and pharmaceutical industries that keep healthcare costs so ridiculously high. 3. Education and student debt relief. Much of today's dialogue around income inequality starts with educational inequality. Government-subsidized tuition, particularly for essential professions, would alleviate the growing student debt crisis. 4. Wage growth policies. The economy continues to leave behind most people for the benefit of the top percent. Corporate executives and shareholders continue to reward themselves while real wages for the vast majority of Americans stagnate. Addressing income inequality requires more than just lip service. It demands major labor market reforms to ensure fair wage growth that actually keeps up with the cost of living. 5. Fix credit and debt structures. This mountain of consumer debt we now face, $17.8 trillion in total household debt with credit card debt surpassing $1.14 trillion, isn't sustainable. The government must step in to regulate predatory lending and offer relief options for those drowning under insurmountable credit card and student loan debt. Interest rate caps, debt forgiveness programs, and broad student loan cancellation are steps in the right direction, but they need to be bold and far-reaching. 6. Tax the super wealthy. Another elephant in the room, America's ultra-wealthy have gobbled up a disproportionate share of economic growth over the past few decades. The tax system has increasingly favored the rich through loopholes, capital gains cuts, and estate tax reductions. To fund the essential programs we just discussed, from housing to healthcare, a fair taxation system needs to target hedge fund managers, multinational corporations, and mega-billionaires who've been running away with the lion's share of the country's wealth. This is not about punishing success. It's about starting to close the ever-widening wealth gap and ensuring that the American dream is once again attainable for everyone, not just the top 1%. 7. Corporate responsibility. Corporations need to start taking responsibility for their role in creating this economic mess. From price gouging during crises, remember how drug prices surged during COVID-19, or how certain industries profited handsomely amid shortages, to paying abysmally low wages, companies must be held accountable. Corporate greed should not be the determining factor for the everyday citizen's ability to buy a house, afford healthcare, or put food on the table. So, here we are, at a turning point in the American economy. It's crucial to ask, will the American dream survive this crossroads? Will homeownership, education, and financial stability once more become achievable for every hardworking individual? Or has the dream been permanently reserved for only those born into the right families or jobs? Policies that directly address the root causes of middle-class erosion, housing shortages, spiraling costs, stagnant wages, excessive debt, are not just necessary, they're urgent. Right now, we're witnessing serious economic fault lines forming. There's a growing divide between those who can afford a home, childcare, and an education and those who can't. If this divide continues to deepen unchecked, the impact on the U.S. economy will be disastrous. Both Harris and Trump are aware of this tension, as are voters. But if political leaders fail to address these urgent issues substantially, the already fragile middle class will continue to hollow out. It's no surprise, then, that Americans are feeling a sense of deep pessimism about the economy. Despite unemployment rate lows in the aftermath of the pandemic, 62% of middle-class Americans now say that higher living costs are hurting their household's financial stability. Per polling data from Harris Poll and Bloomberg, economic anxiety is rampant, creating an environment of distrust, not just in politicians, but in the broader economic system that was supposed to work for them. The pessimism Americans feel isn't a passing moment. It's a symptom of a larger systemic failure, the inability to sustain the middle-class dream. And until these systemic issues are addressed with bold, far-reaching policies, this discontent isn't going anywhere. It's not enough for either party to trot out piecemeal solutions that sound good in campaign speeches. Both Harris and Trump need to drastically reevaluate their platforms to feature substantive reform. Otherwise, the economic discontent we're experiencing today will persist well into the future, affecting election after election, and further polarizing the electorate. Let's recap what we know. Mortgage payments are soaring. The typical American family needs 19 years to save a 20% down payment today, compared to 14 years just a few years ago. Home values have doubled for the lucky few homeowners. But for everyone else, homeownership is merely a pipe dream. Tuition costs have exploded beyond reason, with elite colleges charging more than $90,000 a year. Cars are now financial luxuries, and credit card debt is literally bankrupting millions of Americans. And yet, we're being fed a narrative that says the U.S. economy is doing just fine. It's like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. We keep hearing about GDP growth and wages ticking upward, but the day-to-day reality says something completely different. Looking ahead at the looming Harris-Trump electoral face-off, voters will continue demanding economic promises they've been hearing repeatedly for decades. More jobs, higher wages, lower taxes, affordable homes. But will it be different this time? Donald Trump, with his Make America Great Again rhetoric, is banking on nostalgia. He promises to bring back a time when middle-class life was actually attainable. But those times aren't coming back without deep structural shifts. Cutting regulations and taxes alone didn't fix the middle class in his first term. It only helped the wealthy consolidate more power and wealth. Throwing tariffs at globalization only raises costs for everyday Americans. And don't get fooled again. Trump's America First economic agenda is not a recipe for middle-class salvation. It's a band-aid, a fleeting attempt to push tariffs and protectionism as a cure-all without addressing real issues like systemic wage stagnation and housing unaffordability. On the other hand, Kamala Harris's focus on strategic financial policies aimed at the middle class, such as first-time homebuyer assistance and investments in education, seems more realistic. While she's talking about near-term solutions targeted at making a middle-class life possible, piecemeal aid for healthcare costs, home construction, and education, one has to wonder how much progress can actually be made, especially when it comes to short-term relief. If Harris wants to reverse the slide of the middle class, we need bold reforms that go beyond half measures. Substantial investments in infrastructure, housing, healthcare, and education would be a start. However, there's a question of scale, and whether deep-pocketed special interests and gridlock politics will allow her vision to take hold. But the stakes are clear. If neither candidate can offer bold, real solutions to the middle-class crisis we're experiencing, the American dream will remain an illusion for far too many. As Election Day inches closer, Voters want one thing more than anything else: economic security. But without bold, systemic reform, that security will remain elusive for the millions of Americans who still believe in the promise of a middle-class life. So where does this leave us? With hard truths, truths that politicians on both sides don't have the courage to confront head-on. The current economic management is failing. Over 2 decades of policies, from housing shortages to runaway education costs, have actively dismantled the foundations of middle-class prosperity. Even though inflation may appear tamed in the short term, long-term financial stability is becoming harder and harder to achieve. Ladies and gentlemen, our economy is not okay, and until our political class wakes up from their deep slumber, those aspiring to maintain or achieve a middle-class lifestyle are going to find themselves treading water, if they're lucky. This isn't simply about left versus right, Trump versus Harris. It's about an economic reality that's rapidly splitting the nation into the haves and have-nots. If there's one thing clear, voters are fed up. Now let's see if the politicians finally start to realize it's time to stop talking about bringing back the American dream and start working toward rebuilding it for real. Until next time, folks, keep a close eye on our leaders, keep demanding better, and remember, real change begins when we refuse to accept anything less.